This is our lecture number 24, and we're progressing through the area of developmental psychology. We've already talked a little bit about some of the history, some of the controversy in this area. And what we will do now is we're going to take a look at the primary theories that are scientists, psychologists have advanced in terms of intellectual development, moral development, and emotional development. And we'll really be taking a look at some of the pioneering figures in the area of developmental psychology. So let's begin this assessment by taking a look at these separate components of development. Intellectual development, moral development, emotional development, and we'll also be exploring attachment behavior. That won't be in this lecture, but it will be in the next lecture that follows this. So begin this first by taking a look at these three pioneering figures in developmental psychology, Jean Piaget, Sigmund Freud, and Lawrence Kohlberg. And all of these theorists are considered to be what we call stage theorists. Now, what does it mean to be a stage theorist? Well, they all believe that we pass through very distinct stages in terms of psychological development. In the case of Piaget, the case of Freud, the case of Kohlberg. And of course, Piaget is studying intellectual development, Freud's studying emotional development, and Kohlberg is studying moral development. And each one of them says we pass through these very distinct stages, and we do so at particular ages. The speed that we go through those stages can vary dramatically from one individual to another individual. Some individuals go through these stages more rapidly than do others. Some go through more slowly than others. And lastly, we all go through them in exactly the same order. We don't jump around to a more advanced stage until we've progressed through a more fundamental stage. And again, this order is one, as you will see, that is fixed. But again, the speed that we go through them may vary from one individual to another individual. So again, these theorists then, if anyone says to you, what's a stage theorist? Well, stage theorist is as I've described right here. We go through these distinct stages of development. The speed that we go through them can vary from one person to another person, but the order is always the same. So let's take a look at, one of these pioneering psychologists, developmental psychologists, certainly Jean Piaget, the Swiss psychologist, conducted groundbreaking work back in the 50s and early 1960s. And he taught us an enormous amount about what children actually know and how they come to know it. So he's interested in cognitive development. He's interested in the development of intellect. When we take a look at his theory, it's important to know about these really key concepts that he advanced that are really crucial to understanding these developmental stages. So, for example, here's how he defines intelligence. It's really about adapting to the environment that you live in, to be able to cope in the environment that you live in and make changes. So again, intelligence is really defined in those terms. Secondly, he says we all go through what he calls assimilation. And in assimilation, it's intellectual adjustment. We're digesting information, we're making it similar or rearranging it so that it suits our own particular needs. And all of us go through the assimilation process in which we are constantly trying to consolidate and digest that information that we're exposed to. And a lot of times what we have to do is we have to rearrange that information in order to suit our own particular needs. And lastly, he talks about this concept of accommodation. This is an actual intellectual adjustment. And that adjustment is made so that we can, in fact, take in information. Assimilation is more about taking in information on face value. Accommodation, on the other hand, is more about making an actual intellectual adjustment. And what Piaget would say is that we really have to strike a balance between these two things. We can neither assimilate too much, meaning taking things in on face value, and not really critically analyzing them. And accommodation, on the other hand, is actually making a change in what Piaget says your underlying schema. And indeed, that intellectual adjustment is crucial for you to take in that information. So you can neither assimilate too much or accommodate too much. You must strike a balance between the two of those. So Piaget describes several different steps, stages he calls them. And the first one that you see here is what he calls the sensorimotor period. And the sensorimotor period goes from birth to about 2 years of age, and the major developmental accomplishment during this period of time is integrating sensory information, and the output is some kind of a motor change that takes place. And indeed, the rudimentary forms of symbolic thought perhaps are taking place during this period of time. Piaget says that this is a period of time in which the child is developing what he calls percepts. So in other words, there's a percept for mother. What is mother? Mother smells a certain way, mother looks a certain way, mother acts a certain way. All these things are pulled together into this whole idea, this percept of what a mother really is. The major outcome during this period of time is something that Piaget refers to as object permanence. One of the things you're going to see is that Piaget devised these really interesting experiments in order to test some of these ideas. And this whole idea of object permanence is a fascinating one. When does object permanence really emerge? Well, take a look at this really simple example that you see right here. Here is a young child, probably around 5, 6 months of age, and they're shown this stuffed animal. And they reach for the stuffed animal, and they're like playing with the stuffed animal. And then what Piaget did was this. He put this piece of poster board in between the child and this toy that the child was playing with. And what happens is the child shows very little, if any, reaction that thing that he really liked, that he'd just been playing with, is now gone. It doesn't search for it, doesn't look for it, doesn't show any distress whatsoever that it's gone. So Piaget would say it's out of sight, out of mind, right? You no longer can see it, it's gone, okay? Even though it resides right behind this piece of poster board, right? So Piaget believes that this emerges, object permanence emerges, this idea that objects continue to exist even though you can no longer see them. That emerges about 8 to 9 months of age. But some psychologists, like Renee Baillargeon, for example, whose work we'll be taking a look at, she believes that it's occurring at a much earlier time in life, maybe as young as about 3 to 4 months of age. So again, some more recent developmental psychologists have come along, and they've done some really creative experiments which suggest that this object permanence really does emerge at an earlier period of time. We know, for example, if you take a look at a lot of the work that's been done in terms of examining what's happening to the prefrontal cortical area of the brain, that's not a part of the brain that's fully developed in a young child. And this is where object permanence is probably taking place in terms of working memory. So indeed, there's some exciting biological information now which supports a lot of this idea about the emergence of object permanence and the development of the prefrontal cortical area of the brain. The second stage in Piaget's theory of cognitive development, intellectual development, is called the preoperational period. And the preoperational period begins at about 2 years of age. It goes to about 7 years of age. And the major accomplishment during this period of time is, this a more sophisticated use of language, obviously. Symbolic thought is beginning to occur, but the child during this period of time has a lot of difficulty in terms of logical reasoning. One of the outcomes during this period of time is what we would call a loss of egocentrism. The child now is beginning to see that other individuals have, important things to say, that there are other ways of looking at things, but this too is not fully developed during this period of time. Preoperational period is a fascinating stage. It's really all about assessing what Piaget would call logical thinking. There are experiments that he conducted, very famous experiments that he conducted in order to test the ability of a child in this fundamental category of intellectual adjustment that's called conservation. And to illustrate this aspect of logical thinking, ask a simple question. Can a child understand that an object stays the same even though it has undergone a physical transformation? Take a look at this very simple experiment that you see here, where a child is confronted with these two containers that are identical to one another, that have the same amount of liquid in it. And what we do is we take one of those containers, this one that you see right here, you divide them up and you say, well, this container belongs to you. It says that to the child. And this container belongs to me. And what the experimenter then does is to take one of those containers and pour it into this cylinder that you see here, okay, which is relatively slender. All right, so they pour it in there, and you can see that the water line on it comes up much higher than the water line that's in this container right here. And asked whether or not now these two containers have the same amount of water. The child says no. The child says, well, this container right here has more. And you ask them why, and they say because it's taller. So the child doesn't have any concept whatsoever of this whole idea of conservation of liquids, conservation of volume. Okay, and there are many other experiments that have been done like this. For example, conservation of mass. Take some clay, for example. The one that's right here, we'll call this A, belongs to you as the experimenter. This ball of clay belongs to the child, and you ask the child, are they the same with one another? And they say yes, they're the same. They're identical in terms of the amount of clay. And then what you do is you ask the child to roll his piece of clay into a long hot dog. And then you ask the child, are these now the same? Are they different? Does one have more clay than the other? And indeed, this is something that Piaget believes is this inability really to conserve mass, because the child will say, well, I have more clay. And you ask them why, and they say, because this is longer. So this is a very interesting assessment of logical thinking, and indeed during this preoperational period of time, the child really can't conserve mass, they can't conserve volume, they can't conserve number. Take a look at this simple experiment where you have two lines of marbles. Line A, you say, belongs to the child, and you have the child count them, and they count them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. and you have this other line of marbles that's, your marbles, let's say, as the experimenter, and the child counts them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then what you do is you separate out this line that's right here. You separate them so now there's more space between them. And you ask the child, who has more marbles? Do you have more than me? Do I have more than you? Or do we have the same number of marbles? And indeed, if you take a look at this from the child's perspective, because they really can't conceptualize a number very well, and even if they count them, again, they say, well, this line B, your marbles, you have more marbles than me. So again, they can't really understand this whole idea of number. Conservation of length is another interesting experiment that Piaget conducted. You have 2 pieces of rope, let's say, that are identical to one another. Rope A belongs to you as the experimenter. Rope B belongs to the child, and he puts them up next to one another, and you ask them, are they the same? And the child says, yes, they're the same. And then what you do is you just shift this rope that you see here so that it's no longer side by side with this piece of rope that the child has. And you ask them, do we have the same length of rope, or do you have more than me, or do I have more than you? Is mine longer, or is yours longer? And the child invariably will say that your piece of rope now is longer than their piece of rope. And again, they can't conceptualize length. They can't engage in logical thinking in terms of length. So this is something that's happening during this preoperational period of time. So we get to stage 3 now, which Piaget calls the period of concrete operations. This begins at about 7 years of age, goes to about 11 years of age. And the accomplishment during this period of time, they're becoming more proficient in terms of logical reasoning. This is when what is emerging during this period of time is the ability really to engage in logical thinking more. They can, in fact, solve these very simple problems in terms of conservation of volume and length and number. They can make these what are called transitive inferences. And again, they can reason logically. They can visualize a series of operations. The major outcome, again, during this period of time is the ability to engage in this logical thinking, this conservation that Piaget calls it. So this is the 3rd stage, concrete operations. And again, goes from about 7 to 11 years of age. Then we have the stage of what he calls formal operations, which begins at about 11, goes to about 15 years of age. The adolescent during this period of time is really learning about abstract reasoning, that you can develop a hypothesis and you can test it, and you can test it in a very logical way. So again, abstract reasoning and hypothesis testing is emerging during this period of time. And Piaget says that there's really no period after this in terms, that your cognitive development is really pretty much fully formed during this period of time. During this, by 15 years of age. So indeed, this is Piaget's theory of intellectual development, and they have all of these really interesting tests, some of which I described to you earlier, that have been used worldwide. Again, I want to emphasize, he's a stage theorist. We don't jump around to different stages. We go through these 4 stages in the order in which I presented. For example, we don't start out in the period of formal operations. We don't start out in the period of concrete operations. We go through these 4 stages. Some of us go through them more rapidly than others, but we go through them exactly in this order that we've presented. So that's Piaget's theory of intellectual development. René Baillargeon and Judy Deloche, modern-day developmental psychologists, believe that young children are able to engage in complex reasoning at much earlier ages, and they've devised some really interesting tests of this. And in the videotapes that I've asked you to watch, there's some interesting demonstrations of this, but let's go through the basics of some of these experiments that they performed. René Baillargeon has constructed this really interesting test in her laboratory at the University of Illinois. And here what you see is a 3-month-old child that's looking at this car that's going down this track that you see here. There's a barrier, this yellow barrier right here. And then what happens is the car goes down this ramp and then exits out over the other side. And they look at this, and they look at it for a period of time and follow what's happening. But what if the child instead saw, and again, if this was lifted up, and there was a box that was placed on this roadway, okay? So that when you allow this car to go down this ramp, then the box would actually stop the car. So then you put the screen down. The child thinks that the box is there, but actually it's going to be withdrawn through this hole that's in the back here. The assistant to the experimenter is going to take the box off of there. So what the child sees then is this truck that's going down the ramp, going behind this screen, and again the child thinks that the box is there, but it's been taken away. Child doesn't know that, and what happens is the truck again goes down to the other side and again out through a hole on the other side, and indeed child looks at this much longer. This is an impossible event. There's absolutely no way that that truck would go down and not be stopped by this box that had been placed here. Again, the child cannot see this because the screen is here. It's been taken out by the assistant to the experimenter. And again, this is the impossible event that the child witnesses, and the child looks at it much longer. And indeed, when you take a look at this impossible event, the child looks at it much longer than they do the possible event. Again, the truck going down here unimpeded. Okay, so indeed, this is a very interesting test, and Baillargeon believes that, a child is really capable, much more capable, more sophisticated kind of thinking at an earlier stage. René Baillargeon, her work is considered to be very important in the field of developmental psychology, but psychologist Judy Deloche, I think her work stands out because of her understanding of this whole idea of symbolic thinking and when symbolic thinking emerges. Here's a series of symbols that we are very common, okay, in our culture. And if you take a look at these, again, these are all things that, normal, an adolescent or an adult would know very clearly what these symbols mean. Symbols stand for something else. And indeed, this is something that really separates us from other species, is our ability to engage in that symbolic thinking. Psychologists thought that symbolic thinking didn't really emerge until around 4 to 5 years of age. And again, that comes from a lot of the work that Piaget had done earlier. But Judy Deloche, psychologist Judy Deloche, believes that it emerges very, very early, that is 3 years of age. And she has constructed some fascinating experiments in this area to try to prove her point. So let's take a look at one of these very simple experiments that she performs. Here is a 3-year-old girl that you see with this little dollhouse. Here's the little girl. Here's Judy DeLoach that you see right here. And she has this small Snoopy toy in one hand and a large Snoopy doll in another hand. So she tells this young girl, she says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide Snoopy in this small dollhouse, okay? And I want you to watch, okay, where it's being hidden. So where does she hide it? She hides it behind this little yellow pillow that's in this dollhouse, okay? Then what Judy DeLoach says is that what she's going to do now is she's going to take this big Snoopy doll and she's going to go in the adjacent room, which is behind this curtain that you see here. And there's a replica of this small dollhouse, but it's a large room. And she says, I'm going to hide big Snoopy in the adjacent room in the same place where I hid little Snoopy in this small dollhouse. And then what I want you to do is I want you to come in and find it. So Judy DeLoach leaves the room. She tells the young girl to stay here. She leaves the room. And what she does is she hides it, the large Snoopy, in the same place, again behind this pillow. And she asks the girl to come into the room now to find big Snoopy. And indeed, the little girl goes right over to the pillow, lifts up the pillow, and she sees big Snoopy. So she's found big Snoopy. So indeed, this is a very interesting experiment, because if you were to take a 1.5 or 2-year-old child, they simply would not be able to do this, and they would not be able to locate where the large Snoopy doll is. So using and understanding symbols, according to Judy DeLoach, begins at a much earlier age. She believes that it begins at about 3 years of age. And again, this contrasts very sharply with the work that, that Piaget had conducted earlier. So now let's move on to moral development and the work of Lawrence Kohlberg, again, another pioneer in this area, another individual who's a stage theorist. And again, he believes we pass through 6 distinct stages of moral development, and stages can't be skipped. You have to go through them, okay, in order. And each stage is more elaborate, more integrated than the prior one. So let's take a look at these 6 different stages that moral development that Kohlberg has described. Level 1 is something that Kohlberg calls the preconventional stage. You see this in young children, primarily, this level 1. There's 2 parts to it. During this period of time, it's all about obedience and, responses to punishment. And how can I avoid being punished? The child wants to do anything that they can in order to avoid being punished. That's absolutely where they're at in terms of this period of time, a young child. They are very egocentric. What's in it for me? What benefit is there for me? How am I going to benefit from this? There's no societal perspective whatsoever. So again, very egocentric kinds of responses in terms of moral reasoning during this period of time. Level 2 is called the conventional stage. Again, there's 2 parts to this. This is typically what you see in adolescents and in adults. There is what Kohlberg calls interpersonal accord and conformity. The child is trying to live up to the expectations of their parents, being a good boy, being a good girl. That is really so important to developing adolescent during this period of time. And the next part of this is, authority and the responses to authority and responses to social order. Again, now the child, the adolescent is starting to go beyond this whole idea of individual approval, and it's about obeying social order, and it's about obeying laws and realizing that a society that is organized and functional is one that has a good social order. So again, this is what we call level 2. And I think most individuals certainly get to this point in terms of this second part of this conventional stage, this authority and social order. But this last level is what he called the post-conventional stage, and quite frankly, Kohlberg believes that many individuals never really reach this. Adults never really, many of them never really get to this point. He refers to what he calls social contract orientation, where you're understanding that there are different opinions about things, that laws are social contracts, that majority rules democratically. I think that for most individuals, this is, something that they do grasp in terms of their moral reasoning and thinking. But then we get to this whole idea of universal ethical principles, abstract reasoning, obligation, in some cases, to obey unjust rules, doing what is right. Does everyone really get to this point? And I think that Kohlberg says no. That probably, a small proportion of individuals get to this whole idea of universal ethical principles. So this is Kohlberg's theory about moral development and moral reasoning, and it is considered to be the dominant theory in the area of developmental psychology. An interesting aspect of all this is research that is being conducted by Karen Wynn at Yale University in the Department of Psychology, in which she's been taking a look at the development of moral and ethical reasoning. Are babies born good? Again, is this something that's in our genes? Can infants tell right from wrong? Can a 3-month-old tell good from bad? Again, there's a videotape that you should have watched on this in her research. And indeed, if you take a look at one of the experiments that she has done, that involve puppets, here you have a 3-month-old that's sitting in this baby chair that you see right here. There's the child's head, and he's watching what's happening with these puppets. And you have this striped puppet that you see right here trying to open up this box. So he's trying very hard to open it, but he can't open it up. And then what you have is this helper puppet that in this yellow shirt that tries to help this puppet right here. And indeed, he's doing a really good job helping the puppet to open up, helping this puppet to open up this box. So again, this is the helper puppet right here. But then what happens is this other puppet that you see here in the blue shirt, the bad puppet, comes over and slams the box top down. Okay, so this puppet is not helpful. And Karen Wynn asks the very simple question, if this baby now has the opportunity to choose either the good puppet, the one that had the yellow shirt, or the bad puppet, which one does the infant choose? And which one do they prefer? And indeed, what is found in this case when the child is confronted with this choice is that they tend to pick the kind puppet and not the mean or the bad puppet. So that puppet that had that yellow shirt, that is the one that is selected. So indeed, this is a very interesting experiment and one that challenges, really some of our notions about what you know, babies can actually do, and about their moral reasoning and thinking, and can they tell good from bad? And apparently they can. So indeed, this is a, you know, a very interesting experiment which challenges some of our notions of this these developmental stages that have been advanced by Lawrence Kohlberg. Lastly, what we will do is we will take a look at emotional development from the well-known stage theorist Sigmund Freud. And again, Freud talks about the id, the ego, and the superego. He talks about what he calls psychosexual development, stages of psychosexual development. And again, this whole idea of this iceberg principle where so much is submerged, you know, below the surface. This is the preconscious level here, and this is the unconscious. The ego is the conscious in touch with reality. The id, on the other hand, represents the unconscious conflicts that are going on within an individual, and this superego is really trying to mediate between the demands of the id and the release of all this psychological anxiety and tension and conflict that is occurring, trying to mediate between the unconscious and the conscious. Those principles indeed are very important ones in Sigmund Freud's theory and his theory of psychosexual development. So what drives psychosexual development? Well, it's instinctual urges that we all have, that we're trying to contain, that we're trying to learn how to control, that exists at the unconscious level. And we have what Freud refers to as these energy producing centers. They're primarily sexual in terms of their orientation, and we call it the libido. We're seeking pleasure, we're avoiding pain. Freud is referred to as a hedonist. We'll get into this a little bit more when we get to the whole area of the study of motivation. So with that as background, we'll begin to take a look at Freud's theory of psychosexual development. We have these stages. Again, he's a stage theorist. Oral stage from birth to about 18 months of age, anal stage 18 months to 3 years, phallic stage begins at 3, goes to about 6 years of age, the latency stage goes from 6 years to puberty, and the genital stage goes from puberty to adulthood. These are all stages of what he calls psychosexual development, and we all go through these in this order: oral, anal, phallic, latency, genital. Some of us go through them more rapidly than others. Some of us go through them relatively slow. Some of us may remain fixated at one of these stages for a significant period of time. Freud talks about what he calls erogenous zones. There's key conflicts or developmental tasks. For example, during the oral stage, everything is about sucking and swallowing. Everything is about those activities that are very pleasurable to the child. Denial of them is something that causes distress. Indeed, the erogenous zone is the mouth. The mouth has to be adequately stimulated in order for the child to move on to the next stage of psychosexual development. That next stage is, again, the anal stage, begins at 18 months of age, goes to about 3 years of age. The anus has to be adequately stimulated. This is a period of time, of course, when toilet training is taking place. And indeed, the anal area has to be adequately stimulated in order for the child to really be able to go through this particular time. That erogenous zone, again, has to be adequately stimulated in order for the child to achieve this very important milestone of toilet training. Phallic stage begins at 3 years of age, goes to about 6 years of age. The genitals have to be adequately stimulated. What Freud says is that during this period of time, overcoming what's called the Oedipus complex, meaning that the child, for example, a young boy, wants to achieve attention from the mother, tries to mimic the father, the same-sex parent, in order to try to achieve affection from the mother. In the case of a young girl, it's called the Electra complex, where the young girl tries to mimic the mother in order to achieve the fair amount of affection, from the father. So indeed, the genitals have to be adequately stimulated according to Freudian theory, and this complex, the Oedipus complex and the Electra complex, have to be adequately satisfied in order for the child to move on. The next stage is called the stage of latency. Begins at 6 years of age, goes through puberty. During this period of time, there's very strong attraction with individuals of the same sex, older individuals of the same sex. A young girl admiring and wanting to affiliate with older girls. A young boy admiring and wanting to affiliate with a young boy affiliating with older boys. And Freud would even say that this is a period of possible homosexual development. So this is the stage of latency. There's no real erogenous zone that has to be stimulated during this period of time. Then we get to the genital stage, which begins at puberty and goes into adulthood. The genitals have to be adequately stimulated again. Heterosexual relationships are emerging during this period of time. That is, relationships with the opposite sex. So indeed, these we go through oral, anal, phallic, latency, genital stage in this order. We don't jump from, let's say, oral to latency, then back to anal, then to genital. Again, we go through these in this order. We all go through them in this order, though the speed that we go through them may vary from one individual to another individual. So this now is the basics, I think, in terms of understanding Freudian psychosexual theory. We've also taken a look at Piaget's theory of cognitive development, the development of intellect, development of intelligence, and we've also taken a look at Kohlberg's theory and some of the more recent developmental psychologists who have contributed to it. So our conclusions then, babies and infants are really a lot smarter and more social than we ever thought. And there's a lot of really ingenious research that's going on in the field of developmental psychology that's really helping us to understand and expand the capabilities, mental and social capabilities of developing children. So that concludes this lecture, and we'll soon begin to move on into some other areas in the field of psychology.